The overall position on the invasion front in mid-July was quite favourable for us. The British were intent on changing this at all costs, to break through the static front lines and gain territory beyond. To achieve that, they needed to extract their armour from amongst the great hedgerows and sunken roads, favourable to the defenders, and reach the plains near Falaise, suitable for the deployment of their tanks. The crux of these wide-ranging British plans was the Bourgebus Heights, the key position for launching their operation, which lay 8 kilometres east of the British bridgehead on the Orne. From there, the British would bring the German panzers and reserves to battle and wipe them out, and so clear the way to Paris. On the 18th of July 1944, British 8th Corps with 3 armoured divisions, including the Guards Armoured Division, a total of 877 tanks, left the Orne bridgehead. The right and left flanks of the attack divisions were protected by 1 British and 1 Canadian corps. The attack was prepared by 2,077 bombers, which dropped 7,870 tons of bombs, and 270 medium and heavy guns, with 250,000 shells at their disposal. From 5:45 a.m. until 6:30 a.m., 1,056 Royal Air Force heavy bombers attacked. Then from 7 a.m. until 7:30 a.m., 539 U.S. Air Force bombers, and from 8 a.m. to 8:30 a.m., another 482 U.S. Air Force bombers. Especially hard hit by this bombing preparation were the villages of Emyville, Cagny and Maneville, where our 3 company lay. Never before had such an armada of bombers been used to soften up an enemy prior to an attack. By comparison, in February 1945, Dresden was attacked by only 1,054 Royal Air Force and U.S. Air Force bombers, which dropped 3,425 tons of bombs. At 8 a.m., British 11th Armoured Division with 29th Armoured Brigade and 159th Infantry Brigade crossed the start line, encountering no resistance because the advanced battalions of 16 Luftwaffe Field Division had been wiped out by the carpet bombing. At 8:30 a.m., the British spearheads crossed the Contourne railway line. Here, too, they met no resistance in front of the readiness area of Heavy Panzer Abteilung 503. In the 3rd Company readiness area, I was the Premier, namely the 1st platoon leader who was also the representative of the company commander, and what I said went. Hauptmann Scherf was lodging at the Abteilung command post in Emyville. The mansion house there was quieter than our camp in the open. He was rarely to be seen at that time with the company's fighting staffel, but on the days between operations he had much to catch up on, going back and forth between the orderly room and the tross, including catering, the repair group and the workshop, all a fair stretch from each other. But back to the evening of the 17th of July. Lieutenant Heerlein, Abteilung Ordnance Officer, had invited all available officers to a party at the Abteilung command post. Soon after it started, it was interrupted by a fairly heavy artillery bombardment, which led to 2 dispatch riders being killed. Everything was broken off at once. I had been informed previously that a civilian had been shot dead on the front line, trying to cross over to the British side. On his body, the troops had found precise sketches of the company positions and the Abteilung command post. The commanding officer had immediately issued instructions for the Abteilung to move to another readiness area, for possibly other agents had managed to reach the British with similar sketches. But the High Command, probably Army Group, had not approved the change of position. After the artillery bombardment, I drove back to the company as fast as possible to find all quiet. Therefore, I did not know how to interpret the artillery bombardment. It had been heavier than usual. Was it merely a nuisance barrage or several batteries zeroing in before a major operation? There was no way of telling. I inspected the sentries, warned them to wake me if anything strange happened, crawled under my panzer, wrapped myself in my blanket, and was soon asleep. My companion in the slit trench beneath Tiger 311 was Unteroffizier Werkmeister, my gunner. The other 3 crewmen slept inside the panzer. I was awoken at 6 a.m. by the sound of many aircraft engines, crept out of the trench and through the foliage saw Christmas trees in various colours slowly sinking to the ground. Target marker flares for bombers, I thought at once, but I had no more time to reflect. 200 metres from our wood, a series of great fountains of earth and smoke reared up, and I was struck by a violent pressure wave which almost hurled me to the ground. Seconds later, I was back beneath the Panzer, and not a moment too soon, for a second stick of bombs fell much nearer. The Panzer shook, and my eardrums hurt with the pressure. I realized at once that this attack was aimed at us personally. From now on, I could not think. I was as helpless as a drowning man tossed into raging seas. The air was filled with the whistle of falling bombs, and instinctively I pressed myself closer to the ground. Then followed the deafening explosions and attendant air pressure, increasingly louder as the chain of explosions ran its course towards us. Each aircraft dropped not a single bomb, but a batch of 15 or 20. The bombers came in staggered formations of 10 to 15 aircraft, all dropping their bomb loads simultaneously, wave after wave. The ground trembled. It surprised me that I could have survived it. I had a feeling of total helplessness in the presence of these explosive forces. There was no running away from them. I had no idea how long the bombing would go on. All idea of time was lost. It seemed an eternity since I had lain peacefully asleep under my Panzer. Suddenly, Werkmeister and I were catapulted by the blast into a corner of the trench, covered over with earth, and were probably unconscious for some time until we came to. The blast had swept away the excavated earth which we had lined alongside the tracks and wheels, and so I could now see out through the wheels. My neighbouring Panzer was ablaze. Tiger 312, Unteroffizier Westerhausen's Panzer, had received a direct hit. That was all I could see from my slit trench, although I realised that the blast had shifted my own Panzer slightly to one side. Probably the near miss which knocked us out had caused it. Then it all started again. Down came the next shower of bombs. As I seem to remember, the whole performance lasted 2.5 hours with short pauses. It would be superfluous to repeat the same event occurring over and over. I lay under my Panzer with my fingers in my ears and bit my blanket so as not to cry out. Finally, the attack seemed to come to an end. What a sight met my eyes as I crawled out from under my Panzer. Of the once so beautiful parkland, nothing remained but shredded trees, churned meadows, and giant bomb craters, so numerous that they overlapped, a grey, repulsive moonscape and a mist of dust which made breathing difficult. Through the thick fog it was possible to see the red glow of trees and cornfields burning. That was my first impression as I stood behind my Panzer and had a look around. It was incomprehensible how the surroundings had changed. Then life returned. The crews crept out of their slit trenches under the Panzers, or from within them, pale and bewildered, more suspecting than knowing how close to death they had been. I went to the Panzer on our right. It had received a direct hit and looked like a giant opened sardine tin. Flames licked the wreckage. Of Unteroffizier Westerhausen and his crew there was no trace. I worked my way through a veritable primeval woodland and now came to the gigantic crater in front of Oberfeldwebel Sachs's Tiger 313. The Panzer itself had been flipped over by the blast and now lay on its turret, wheels in the air. We found 2 crewmen dead under it, and of the other 3 there was no trace. Where my frontline repair group had been was only a crater. There would have been 5 or 6 men who had sought shelter beneath their 2 Panzers, but now they could not be found. The platoon leaders arrived, still confused. We had no time to discuss what we had just lived through, however. Now we had to act. We had to restore our Panzers to operational status, but most of them first had to be shoveled free from the earth piled up to the turret. Some had fallen trees across them, and their tracks broken. With our few tools aboard, 2 shovels and a pickaxe per Panzer, how were we to get the company operational again? Additionally, the work had to be broken off frequently, when salvos from heavy artillery, probably naval guns, targeted our area. The men made a superhuman effort, for we knew now that it was life or death. I also noticed that 10 metres behind my Panzer was a crater 6-8 metre deep, which would have swallowed it up comfortably. If the bomb had landed a fraction of a second later, it would have been a direct hit, and these memoirs would never have been written. The thick armour plate over the engine at the rear of the Panzer had been deformed as though hit by a bomb that had failed to explode. Upon examination, we established that the cooling unit had been damaged by blast. My Panzer was therefore not combat-worthy, and I had to change vehicles again. Our situation was now fairly difficult. We could hear tank guns and MGs firing not too far off. Had the British broken through, and were they already close? I had not been able to restore radio contact with Abteilung, and had no idea how they might have got on. I also had no idea who on our defensive front would still be in a position to repulse a British attack after the murderous bombardment. In order to clarify the situation, I set off on foot for Abteilung. The whole time, enemy artillery fire was incessant, much louder than before, and the shelling reaching much closer to us. I jumped from crater to crater, always with an eye for cover whenever I heard a fresh salvo whistling over. Thus my progress was laborious, what with the tree trunks and great craters I had to surmount. Finally, I reached the path which led along the boundary of the parkland to Emyville. There were fewer bomb-pitted areas here, and the going was easier. From behind a bend in the road, the Tiger I of Hauptmann Fromm came towards me. I reported the status of the company, and he ordered me to get it out of the readiness area as soon as possible and set up a defensive front on the left flank of the suspected British attack corridor between Manneville and Cagny. This would prevent a breakthrough in the direction of Emyville. At first it remained uncertain how long the company would need before it could move out. The noise of fighting from the west had grown so loud, meanwhile, that I could not be sure that the British would allow me the time to restore operational readiness. I could hear a great droning sound, as if a large number of vehicles were moving from north to south, but nothing could be seen. A delicate veil of smoke lay over the land. I hurried back to the company, taking cover whenever the heavy-caliber naval shells howled over, whirling splinters and clumps of earth everywhere when they exploded. At company it still looked unpromising. The least damaged was Lieutenant Rambo's 3rd platoon. 3 Tigers of my I platoon were write-offs, and work was going all out on the 4th. 2nd platoon reported the hope of having 3 Panzers operational soon. My main concern was whether we could beat the British to it. If their tanks arrived right now in this readiness area, we would have to attempt to evade capture using close combat weapons. The operational Panzers went to the park entrance gate. It was difficult to steer these mighty and to some extent cumbersome Tigers between the giant craters. Anybody who has seen woodland after a hurricane, with giant trees lying everywhere, can perhaps imagine how the once well-cared-for park now looked. We still kept hearing the noise of vehicles nearby, between it the reports of tank guns and the clatter of MG fire, though these noises of battle seemed to be coming from much further afield. Had the British already passed us by? Where were German troops? Had the carpet bombing wiped them all out? We had no contact with any of them, either by radio or messenger. It might have been about 10 a.m., perhaps later, when we had 6 Panzers roadworthy. They were still listed for the workshop, but at least running, and, so I believed, could fire their guns. I have no idea which number Panzer I boarded. The main thing was, we were rolling. After 1.5 kilometre along the park wall, we were held up southwest of Manneville. 2 of my Panzers had engine fires and could only follow at a slow speed. Around 11 a.m. we saw 2 Shermans advancing through a depression, carrying out reconnaissance against us. It was only then that we discovered more damage to our Panzers from the carpet bombing than had been detected earlier. We opened fire with our guns, but fired wide. The blast had decalibrated them. Where 1 round had been sufficient before, now we needed 3. Where we had parked was also not ideal. Our view was obstructed by hedges and bushes, so that although we were to some extent under cover, we could only use our firepower with difficulty. In order to have a better field of fire, we shifted our position, for to judge by the noises, the British corridor through which they were making inroads had to run immediately in front of us. My aim was to attack them in the flank. Going around a small wood, the company drove at first to the southwest in the direction of Cagny, from where it would then turn west to the Le Prieur farmstead. That, at any rate, was the plan. During the manoeuvre there were 2 sharp explosions, one after the other. Feldwebel Schönrock's Panzer burst into flames. It had been penetrated by a hit from ahead, as had the Panzer of Feldwebel Müller. We retrieved the wounded and took them on the rear of a Panzer to the nearby dressing station at Manneville. The worst case was Unteroffizier Mattes, with severe burns. The other Tigers pulled back 200 meters on my orders and took up fresh positions. We did not know exactly from where the fire had come. As both panzers had received frontal hits, the shells must have been fired from Cagny, 1,200 meters ahead of us. But at this time, Cagny was in German hands. It was one puzzle after another, for until then we knew of no British weapon which could penetrate the frontal armour of a Tiger. At last I had finally managed to restore radio contact with Fromm, the Abteilung commander. He was with the panzers of the Abteilung HQ, very near the Manneville Chateau. Hauptmann Scherf was also there with his Tiger 300. Since it had fallen quiet in my vicinity, I walked there and reported the status of my company. 2 Tigers total write-offs after frontal penetration, guns decalibrated, engine fires due to failure of cooling systems. We also had 16 dead. All our panzers ought to have been at the repairers, but in this situation in the face of the enemy, we had to act for as long as possible, as though we were capable of a really serious resistance. From there I went to the main dressing station again. Unteroffizier Mattis looked dreadfully mutilated. He had been given injections, but I doubt if he recognized me. He died a short time later. I went back to our previous readiness area. The crews of the panzers abandoned there had meanwhile been brought out by our Tross. I looked over the panzers. My 311 could really have been towed out. The damage to the other panzers was too serious. Oberfeldwebel Sachs's 313 lay upside down. This 58-ton panzer had been simply blown over. What forces this bombardment had unleashed. I still could not believe what had swept over us there. Where my frontline repair group had been earlier, I found a 20-litre canister of cold tea. I shouldered it and returned to my company. They had nothing to report. We were grateful for the tea in the midday heat. Towards 4 p.m., Hauptmann Fromm ordered 3 company to decamp, recovering those panzers still capable of repair with the available tools. I put together a towing platoon. The roadworthy panzers, mostly those with external bomb damage, towed the ones immobilized by engine or running gear damage. While the towing platoon went off to our rearward services at Roupières, I returned with my Tiger to our readiness area to try to tow out my 311. While my crew set to work with a will under great pressure of time, I looked over the other stranded panzers, which included Sachs's 313. The upside-down monster was quite impressive. Some of the wheels had been dislodged and the tracks ripped off. As I stood behind it staring, it struck me that the emergency exit hatch on the turret, which could only be opened from inside, was a few centimeters ajar. This hatch was so constructed that if opened from inside, the weight of the lid would cause it to open fully. Because the panzer lay on its turret, the hatch could not be opened, and a great lifting force would be necessary to raise the panzer first. Anybody still inside the fighting compartment was therefore trapped. I climbed up to the small gap of the partly open hatch and called inside. As if by some miracle, I got an answer. I found that my attempts to open the hatch any wider were fruitless, and summoned 3 men to help. With our combined force, we got the hatch open and shored it up with a thick wooden beam. Oberfeldwebel Sachs was the first to emerge, then the gunner and finally the driver. All had bruises and contusions and burns from contamination with battery acid. They had been unconscious for some hours, then awoke to find themselves in an overturned panzer, hopelessly trapped and wedged in, and we brought them out more dead than alive. Now it was high time for us all to get out of there. The Abteilung had gone to clear up a breach in the line near Cagny, and a new defensive front had been set up about 5 km further back. I was not aware of this, and scouted first of all a route wide enough for a tow, and when darkness fell, I got my Tiger 311 towed away with the greatest difficulty. Obergefreiter Seal distinguished himself especially, steering the panzer despite his serious burns. Shortly after we had vacated the park, the British arrived to occupy it. Once again, I had come through unscathed. A British report attributes the failure of their forces to capture Cagny until the late afternoon of the 18th of July, much later than their planning had allowed, to the attack on the left flank of their advance by 6 Tigers of Heavy Panzer Abteilung 503, which had miraculously survived the carpet bombing. The Wehrmacht report for the 24th of July, 1944 states, Since midday Tuesday, German forces have put out of action 420 British and North American tanks on the invasion front. Most of the enemy tanks were destroyed or captured in the fighting eastwards of the Orne. From the numbers in a single day, the bitterness of the fighting and the course of the operations can be inferred. Heavy Panzer Abteilung 503 under Hauptmann Fromm and Artillerie Panzerabwehr, anti-tank artillery. Abteilung 1039 under Hauptmann Witzel caused the enemy especially heavy losses. Hauptmann Witzel's Abteilung put 35 British tanks out of action before he died a hero in the bitter struggle. Having joined the Tross at Roupières, I rolled myself in my blanket under a large tree and slept and slept. On the 19th of July, I saw to it that my panzers went into the workshop. Then I received the commanding officer's order that I was to take 3 days convalescent leave in Paris. I shook hands with him and anybody else I saw in delight at this well-deserved pause in the fighting. Oberleutnant Dr. Barkhausen, the Abteilung adjutant, came along too. He knew Paris well from his student years and was an excellent tour guide. Our departure on the morning of the 20th of July was delayed for having celebrated too much the previous evening with the workshop company, and upon awaking we found ourselves not yet fit to travel. At midday we set off for Paris in the Volkswagen, full of expectations. A wonderful journey completed in 3 hours. How did we get there? The co-driver sat on the right-hand mudguard, looking backwards to keep an eye on the sky for enemy aircraft. The driver and passengers kept watch ahead. On this run we were not molested by aircraft, although apparently the enemy fighter bombers were all over Normandy. We lodged at the Hotel Commodore on Boulevard Haussmann, a Wehrmacht hotel. Barkhausen went with me that first evening to the Lapin Agile on Montmartre. It was a really highbrow literary cabaret. I had been expecting to see a bit more flesh, but such cheap pleasure was not on Dr. Barkhausen's agenda. When we got back to Boulevard Haussmann towards 10 p.m., we were approached by some ladies of the night, and from them we learned of the attempt to assassinate Hitler. They also told us that at that moment in Paris, the SS was being arrested by the Wehrmacht. It was amazing that the news could have got round so fast. What were my feelings at hearing this news? It had less effect on me than its far-reaching consequences might have led one to expect. Nobody knew anything for certain, it was all just rumours. Finally we learned, without further details, that the attempt had failed. I have to confess that the entire event, the fact of the attempt and its failure, excited my interest very little at first, although I did feel a certain satisfaction at the arresting of the SS. Not at the front, but in the Etape, the occupied areas between the front lines and the Reich, as here there were substantial reservations about the presence and preferential treatment shown to the SS. In the Etape, however, there were also substantial reservations about service centres of all kinds for Jüst-Frontschwein. Despite what one may imagine about how it was then, in Paris for the first time we were captivated by the flair of the city. After the fighting in Normandy only 2 days previously, it was marvellous and beautiful in an unreal way, with its easy living, its pleasures, its elegance, its peaceful appearance, life and work. All we wanted to do at that moment was experience it and enjoy it. In those first few hours, I was like a peasant farmer visiting a great city for the first time, and once it had begun to sink in, I acclimatized very quickly to the environment both inwardly and outwardly. We visited all the must-see tourist attractions: Les Invalides, the Louvre, Jeu de Paume, Notre Dame, Sacré-Cœur de Montmartre, Palais de Trocadero, and the Eiffel Tower. In the flea market at the Porte de Clignancourt, I spent all the cash I had on things to send home, finally even buying a bolt of cloth which I exchanged when the money ran out. The first 2 days passed very quickly, and on the morning of the third day we were supposed to set off back. To my great surprise, Hauptmann Scherf appeared at the hotel to inform me that 3 Company was to pass all its available panzers to 2 Company before transferring to the troop training depot at Mailly-le-Camp near Châlons, where it would receive an issue of new Tigers. Lieutenant Copper was handling the transfer of the company and was expected with the company in Paris in a few days on the way to Mailly. During the period of rest and recuperation, we would be attached to Panzer Brigade 10 at Reims, and Hauptmann Scherf drove me there at once to make contact. On the drive, he revealed that he was being transferred and would probably be taking over another Tiger Abteilung, and, what was more important for me, that I would become company leader of 3 Company. An advance party from the company went to Mali, myself following 2 days later. I found that the best possible preparations had been made there. A day later, I was ordered back to Paris in order to organize the delivery of our new panzers with HQ West, Transport Command, and all other imaginable useful or superfluous administrative offices. The paper war had blossomed, and especially in Paris, a great number of offices needed to justify their existence. Our expected panzers had not yet left Germany, and therefore we had a few days free. So as to give the soldiers of our company something of Paris, Hauptmann-Chef allowed the transport from Normandy to Mailly to pause for 2 days in the French capital. The men could stroll the streets in small groups and see the sights. They were accommodated in the chateau at Vincennes. At the training depot we were given space to bivouac near the village of Sompuis. At the beginning of August, 3 companies' panzers arrived. They were the newest version of the Tiger, SDKF's 182, the Tiger II. A large amount of their equipment was missing, and a squad was dispatched at once to Germany to fetch it. I sent one of the lorries to pass through Rastatt to drop off my purchases from the flea market. Meanwhile, we worked all out to get the new panzers operational. The days were filled with painting on the camouflage scheme and turret numbers, running them in and calibrating the weapons. Meanwhile, a group of photographers from the propaganda company came by to snap the daily routine of an operational panzer company. While doing so, the panzers of Feldwebel Seidel and Unteroffizier Jackal suffered damage to the engine and gears, respectively. I went forward again to the Abteilung command post in order to report to the commanding officer in person on the status and difficulties of our refresher period. On this journey, I came into contact for the first time with the French resistance movement. The Maquis, there was some danger, but I came out of it unscathed. Nevertheless, my impression after this journey was that the situation looked anything but rosy. At the command post, I heard the broadcast of the speech by Dr. Robert Ley, who, as head of the German Arbeitsfront, was one of the most unpleasant firebrands. This was his notorious speech following the 20th of July, in which he characterized the nobility as blue-blooded Schweinehunde and made some frightening threats. I was disturbed and shocked. We discussed it. Fromm said in his dry way, "Young man, don't let it get to you. We shall protect you." Meanwhile, the names of some of the group of assassins of the 20th of July had been made known. The greater part of them came from old noble families, which irritated me. I could not believe that these men would have acted from pure self-interest or whatever other reason had been put forward by officialdom. Much more likely the most serious reasons lay behind it. Whatever it was, it had nothing to do with me. It was a pity that Rommel was out of action after his severe wound of the 17th of July. We had great faith in him. A word from him now would have helped us greatly. I discussed my fears with Hauptmann Wiegand, head of the supply company, Oberleutnant Dr. Barkhausen, our adjutant, and also with Hauptmann von Eichelstreiber, commanding officer of 2 Company. We were in shreds inwardly, but we could see no way out of the hopeless situation, neither for the German Volk nor for ourselves personally. Nevertheless, at the centre of all considerations was the urgent need to get the company operational as quickly as possible, for it was needed at the front. We knew that no turn of the military tide was going to come, and that the leaders could no longer deceive us with their all too transparent pleas to hold out until it did so. What we did hope, however, was that by fighting on we might be able to force an honourable armistice. This became the new catchphrase. For that reason, we were prepared to keep all our forces active. We also spoke frequently of the idea that after the war, first of all, there would have to be a good clear-out of the interior. After the 20th of July, the Wehrmacht had found itself on the defensive. Everything was moving towards an SS state. Himmler had been appointed commander of the reserve army, so that the personnel office, training and the officers' schools were all under his direction. The Wehrmacht was ordered henceforth to use the Hitler salute. The military salute was abolished. This affected us deeply, for the latter was what distinguished us outwardly from the Waffen-SS. We held them in high esteem as outstanding troops, but for us they were the Nazi Party's army, and we did not want to be that under any circumstances. On the 11th of August 1944, I was able to load the first transport train with 5 King Tigers. I took charge of it myself. The unloading yard was Paris, since Normandy was out of the question. The front was approaching the French capital at alarming rate. We received another 3 wagons with ammunition for our panzers and 2 wagons of spare parts and workshop equipment. Because a 72-ton King Tiger was a great burden for the bedding of the railway tracks, the Tiger transporters could not be coupled to each other, but had to have a so-called protective wagon between them. In our case, these were not empty wagons, but the previously mentioned 5 with ammunition and spare parts. Because of enemy air supremacy, this was an unpleasant situation, but there was nothing I could do about it. It was a wonderful summer's day when the rail journey began. We had just passed Cézanne and were happy to have the station behind us because it offered rewarding targets for enemy airmen. We lay in the sun behind the Panzer on the Simswagen enjoying life. Simswagen were special Reichsbahn railway transporters for Tigers. Suddenly, from a clear sky, machine gun fire. The locomotive blew off steam, whistled plaintively, and the train came to an abrupt halt. My first thought was the Maquis, who were very numerous in this area. Then I saw a line of thunderbolts flying towards us, one behind the other. I jumped up and took cover below the Simswagen and between the rails, but splinters from the explosive shells sprayed all around me, forcing me to shift my position. I waited for the attack to finish, and then jumped up to the Panzer in which my crew were seated. By a stroke of bad luck, the commander's hatch jammed, and in my excitement I failed to open it. The aircraft banked for a fresh attack. I lay on the turret without any cover and watched them dive down towards me, saw the muzzle flashes, and the shells whizzed 10 meters above my head. While I was trying to get the hatch open, another attack came in, this aircraft so close that I could see the pilot. I escaped unhurt this time too, and the Panzer crew finally got the hatch open from inside. I was still sliding into my commander's cupola when the next attack arrived, the shells exploding in front of me on the turret. Because I had pulled my arms across my chest to get through the narrow hatch opening, I caught a quantity of small splinters in my lower right arm and a few larger ones in the chest. I was extremely lucky not to receive injury to my face or eyes. At the same time, my radio operator Obergefreiter Tannhauser, who had opened his entry hatch a few centimeters, received a severe wound to the neck through this small gap, and my gunner, Unteroffizier Werkmeister, was wounded in the hip. We applied emergency dressings to each other while one attack after another ensued. When I looked out through the viewing slit of my cupola, I was horrified to see the rear of our Panzer burning brightly, while the 2 ammunition wagons either side of the Simswagen were also on fire. The shells nearest us exploded with a great roar. The fire radiated enormous heat. It was difficult to see if the flames were coming from the engine compartment of the Panzer or from the surface. Meanwhile, the fighter bombers had withdrawn, having done their worst. I stood with the fire extinguisher in the turret fighting every flame which licked at me. In the Panzer, soon we could hardly tolerate being half drowned by the foam any longer. The 8.8 centimeter ammunition in the 2 burning wagons was exploding all around. It must have made quite a fireworks display. What I feared most was that the great heat would cause the Panzer's petrol tanks to explode, taking us up with it. Furthermore, we had 88.8 centimeter rounds inside a fully fueled Panzer. Therefore, 5 of us sat in the Panzer, 3 of us wounded, without being able to protect ourselves against the fire or heat. It was a frightening situation, for something worse was bound to happen, and we couldn't abandon the vehicle while the wagons were still burning and the exploding ammunition whizzed around our ears. During our transport from Germany, I had watched as a company of Panthers performed an emergency unloading during a low-level air attack. All Panzers turned 90 degrees on the platform wagon and then drove directly from the wagon onto the ground, where they dispersed widely. Later in passing, I saw the tracks in a field of wheat and made a note to myself. The Panther Company suffered no losses. I recalled this procedure, and it seemed to me the only possibility now. Turn 90° on the Simswagen and descend. This was a double stretch of track, therefore it was possible. I gave the driver the order. I had forgotten, however, that the extra broad tracks of our Panzer stowed alongside the vehicle prevented a 90° turn. The engine came to life. The Panzer turned slowly, then stopped mid-turn with the track overhanging. Suddenly the Panzer inclined to the left, and before we realized what was happening, it fell off and lay on its turret near the rails. Being inside as the tank slowly overturned was ghastly. The Panzer was still burning, while around us the ammunition in the open wagons continued to explode. After about an hour of unbearable waiting, the wagons finally burnt out. I got free through the loader's hatch. Then the men of my transport who had sought cover in the Panzers or in the field came running up, and the fire in my Panzer was finally extinguished. As was established later, both petrol tanks had been holed by enemy fire, and the Panzer would probably have blown up if it had not overturned. Because it had done so, the fuel from the tanks had eventually run out freely and did little damage while burning. We retrieved our wounded. After searching the whole area, we found 6 severely wounded, 5 walking wounded, and near the locomotive, the dead body of Unteroffizier Wehrheim. All the ammunition and spares wagons were burnt out, the rails were torn up, and so the last railway line into Paris still functioning had been disrupted. We brought the wounded to a nearby railway workers' house. I borrowed a bicycle and went along the railway line with a local to the nearest station at Estenay in order to telephone the German rail authorities and request that a military hospital be informed. I did not succeed in the latter, but when I got back to the wrecked train, the French Red Cross was in attendance with an ambulance and German doctor. The French had watched the attack from Estenay and had set out at once with their ambulance. Shortly before the air attack began, a German ambulance train had passed us on the neighbouring tracks heading for Germany. On seeing the attack, the train had stopped and came back. Therefore my wounded were in good hands straight away, though Oberfeldwebel Bormann died during the journey. I couldn't leave my transport without a commander, and so merely had my wounds dressed and accepted a tetanus shot. I sent a dispatch rider with my report to the remainder of the company at Mailly, and another to Paris, where I expected Hauptmann Scherf would be at the Hotel Commodore. I was not aware of it at the time, but Hauptmann Fromm was also there after gathering the wheeled vehicles of the Abteilung together at Pontoise, as they came back from the Falaise Pocket and the Seine. After a few hours, a Reichsbahn railway construction train with an 80-ton crane arrived, but did not start work until the surrounding area had been searched for unexploded bombs and shells. After the body of Unteroffizier Wehrheim had been buried on the edge of the woods, a locomotive came and took the remnants of my transport to the nearest small station to be disembarked. We stayed there for 4 days, because the line ahead of it and behind was under continual air attack. The time I spent there was not pleasant because of the heat. We had no food. I heard nothing from company, and my wounds caused me a lot of discomfort. It surprised me greatly that I did not hear from company. Both dispatch riders had returned without a reply. Therefore, I could only wait until the transport was able to continue. On the 4th day, a Hauptmann arrived from the HQ of the General of Panzer Troops West, who had been at Mailly. He was accompanied by Lieutenant Rambo, who now relieved me. The Hauptmann brought me to his HQ in Paris, where I was interrogated closely respecting the events of the 12th of August, and had to submit a full written report. I did not feel uncomfortable about any action I had taken, however, and ultimately the matter was forgotten. After the process ended, it was late evening. The General's command post was at St. Cloud. When I was stationed in Paris after the war, I often passed this building, which always reminded me of my interrogation. At my request, I was taken to Hotel Commodore on Boulevard Haussmann, where I met Hauptmann Scherf. We sat talking for hours in the hotel bar, but if I asked what steps he had taken regarding my transport, I cannot remember the answers. Next morning, I went to the assembly hall for the wounded at the École Militaire on the Champ de Mars. As it was getting decidedly unpleasant in Paris at that time, and the military hospitals there were being evacuated, I was taken to the military hospital for the SS Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler at Meaux, where I received the best of treatment. After 2 days, this hospital was also pulled back, and I came to Château Thierry, Really primitive and the town a miserable place. Next day I took the first opportunity available to go to Reims. Here the hospital was that kind of huge operation in which I would not have dreamed of being interned, and I landed up in the wounded assembly area. I skillfully avoided being put on the transport for the Reich, which was the last place I wished to go, and reported back instead to Panzer Brigade 10 responsible for re-equipping the company at Miley. Here I was given a very friendly welcome. I was told where to find a hotel room, I got a new uniform, my pay, money for my food and ration coupons. Now I was in the right place and received my walking wounded discharge at the wounded assembly point, though I had to report back there for a checkup every other day. At first those days I spent in Reims were pleasant. I ate in a restaurant and took coffee in a coffee house complete with dance orchestra, where for the first time I heard American jazz. I remember well the Tiger Rag. In the Reich this kind of music had been prohibited for years, and so I had never heard it before. I found that it struck a chord with me. Whenever I hear In the Mood or the Tiger Rag nowadays, it reminds me of my time in Reims. By chance I came across a number of Abteilung men who had all lost contact with their companies through their stay in military hospital. I myself had no idea where the Abteilung was to be found either, and so found them quarters in Reims, and gave them orders to report to me at noon every day at the hotel. Paris had already been lost to us by this time. At Reims I met Oberschirmeister, senior motorpool NCO, Hasselbeck, who had come from the company at Miley, and told me that it still had 2 drivable Tigers, which had to be got out before the Americans arrived. Also, my Panzer 311 lay beside the railway embankment with a burnt-out engine. Hasselbeck had not had contact with the company for several days, but I felt that I really had to make the effort to re-establish contact, so I left my people at Reims and went with Hasselbeck in his Volkswagen to Miley. The situation regarding the 2 panzers at Miley was very unfavourable. One could manage a few hundred metres under its own power, the other needed to be towed. Next morning I had both of them brought to the loading ramp and changed their tracks for the train journey. This was very difficult because half of the narrower tracks required were missing from the Simswagen. After much puzzling it over, my clever people found a solution even here. I went to the Transport Kommandantur at Chalons, requested wagons and a departure number, and arranged at Epernay station for a locomotive to be available for my train at the hour indicated. It could only be a few more days before the Allies arrived, and none of the foregoing was as easy as has been described, because it had to be argued out with both the Wehrmacht and Reichsbahn departments. They were all afraid of giving out any orders which were not routine. Some bureaucrats showed complete indifference. This was all about 2 Tigers. I still had several long journeys to make, and since I needed to be independent, the most important thing was to obtain wheels from somewhere. On the drive through Chalons, I made a stop at the motor pool, and after much talk, I managed to convince the Étape jackass of the importance of my mission. The last available motorcar belonged to the Chalons Gendarmerie. I got a requisition docket for this vehicle and finally took possession of the black Citroën. In this vehicle over the next few days, I covered over 1,000 kilometres, including the stretch between Reims and Meilly 3 times. The Tigers were loaded, and as everything seemed to be going smoothly, I returned to my Tiger 311 near Cézanne. The Panzer had been got back on its tracks, and my next problem was to have it towed out of the danger area, for the 18-ton tractors needed for the purpose were probably the rarest vehicles in the German Wehrmacht. I wanted at least 3 of them to tow my Tiger. First, I went back to Meilly. The transport with my Tigers had already left the station. The enemy armoured spearhead had already been sighted at Arcis-sur-Aube, about 15 kilometres away. They could arrive at Meilly at any moment. After I had helped to clear out the soldiers' hostel, I went back to Reims. It was my last night there. The next day I set out on the hunt for the tractors. I tried my luck at Panzer Brigade 10 and all the workshop units of the Luftwaffe without success. None was to be found anywhere. Slowly my hopes of getting the panzers out began to evaporate. The vehicle returned at midday and reported having seen no sign of the advancing enemy. Therefore I sent the Volkswagen to Cézanne to get the rest of the crew to safety. They were there to destroy the panzer once the enemy turned up. In the Epernay area, however, the The Volkswagen was held up for 2 hours by fighter bomber attacks, and when they finally arrived at Cézanne, they ran into the American spearhead. I was told all this the next day when I returned to Reims. The workshop supervisor and driver, who had remained behind in the Panzer, were taken prisoner by the Americans, but arrived home safe and well a couple of years later. Meanwhile, I had discovered a Panzer recovery platoon in the area around Laon, but my journey there bore no fruit, for all their tractors were out on jobs, although I did at least discover the location of the HQ of the General Commanding Panzer Troops West. A Führer HQ had been set up near Laon-Soissons, consisting of 3 large compounds with all the usual trimmings. The HQ was now housed in the so-called Führer compound, after having been forced to flee from Paris. They were unable to help, but referred me to the so-called Göring compound, where I ran into my former Panzer Regiment 35 regimental commander, General Eberbach. He was taken prisoner a few days later with his staff. The C&C West told me that a Panzer recovery platoon was in the woods at Compiègne. Therefore I drove there through the night. The description, the woods at Compiègne, was fairly imprecise, and more by luck than anything else I found the unit. Finally, I had run to earth the long-sought 3 tractors, and would have set off with them straight away for my Panzer 311 via Château-Thierry. And Cézanne, had they had any fuel. Where could this be conjured from? After 2 hours of searching, I contacted some corps staff or other who granted me 1,000 litres from a compound in Compiègne. The tractors tanked up before daybreak, but taking to the road with these 3 towing machines by day would have been pure suicide. The slow and cumbersome vehicles would have been certain victims of the fighter bombers, and so there was nothing for it but to wait for nightfall. By chance, I met an Abteilung vehicle and learned that the Abteilung was operational with its remaining panzers near Beauvais. I gave the driver a report for the commanding officer, advising him of my impending return to the Abteilung, then went back to the HQ of the General of Panzer Troops West at Laon. From a glance at the map, I saw that since the position of my panzer was now behind enemy lines, my objective was frustrated, and so I released the tractors and took the most direct route back to Reims. These drives were very tiring, for we rarely had a night's rest. The distances to be covered were getting longer, and we always had to keep a lookout for enemy aircraft. On several occasions we were very lucky and got our car under cover just in time. Back at Reims, the whole city was in the throes of great excitement. The enemy was at the gates. Oberschirmeister Haselbeck was waiting for me. He told me about the efforts involving my 311, and also that through the negligence of the driver, his Volkswagen had been stolen. Also that the train transport with the 2 panzers and crews had arrived at Reims and had been rerouted onwards immediately by the Reichsbahn because of the proximity of the enemy. He had also put aboard the train all the personnel of the Abteilung I had gathered together in Reims, so at least those 2 tigers were safe. Now I had to go to Charleville, where I arrived that evening with Haselbeck. Whereas in Reims, chaotic, undisciplined disorder had reigned, and ugly scenes had been played out, at Charleville all was still calm. At the station command post they knew nothing of my train transport. The friendly station commander took us both into his home, and I finally had a wonderful sleep. The command post was set up in the station house in which the Kaiser had stayed during the First World War. Next morning I saw my transport train in a goods yard near Charleville. I took charge of it, and after making many telephone calls to arrange a locomotive for the later stage of the journey, set off for Liège, where there was a large panzer workshop. Meanwhile, panic had also broken out in Charleville. Rumours were rife, and everybody was simply fleeing aimlessly. The soldiers' hostel had been abandoned in great haste by the Red Cross nurses. Infantrymen plundered it. The field gendarmes were powerless. I brandished my pistol to prevent some sly foxes making off with the cigarette stocks and arranged for a fairly reasonable distribution. Haselbeck had meanwhile found a garage containing 3 cars in pristine condition, abandoned by the field commandantur. Quickly and skillfully these were changed tactical insignia, etc. Painted over, while I forged some documents, I felt justified in doing this, proving our right to the vehicles. Providing the rightful owners did not recognize them, there was practically nothing to stop us. I made a gift of my rather tired Citroën to an infantryman returning from military hospital to help him in his search for his unit. All 13 men not needed for the panzer transport now piled into my 3 cars. Fuel was still a problem, but we solved that at Bethel railway station, where we found a rail tanker wagon. Despite every imaginable objection, we got our petrol. Because the road via Léon was already in enemy hands, we had to retrace our steps to Charleville, and from there head for Beauvais via Hirson-Saint-Quentin-Ham-Montdidier. The journey was very tiring because at night column after column was flooding back eastwards along this road. We reached our destination. The Abteilung had put up clear road signs, and thus I reported back to my commanding officer with 3 vehicles and 13 men. The Abteilung command post had been established in a chateau in the middle of a small wood. My surprise reappearance from military hospital and the recovery from Miley of the 2 panzers, already written off by Abteilung, gave rise to great joy and raised our spirits. Benjamin, the ordnance officer, put me in the picture regarding the situation. The Abteilung, hard-pressed in fighting east of the Orne, had been surrounded in the Great Falaise pocket. Although it had managed to fight its way out almost at once, it must have experienced a great drama in doing so, followed by crossing the Seine under constant enemy air attack. North of the Seine, only the freshly delivered panzers of 3 Company were available to oppose the American bridgehead at Mantes, and here they had suffered heavily. The enemy's material superiority and air supremacy was simply too great. Only one of the Abteilung's panzers was still operational, that of Lieutenant Rambo. The situation around the command post was uncertain, and higher command had no clear view as a result of the rapidly changing situation. Therefore, we had ourselves sent out scouting parties from our reconnaissance platoon. I learned that Hauptmann Scherf would very soon be sent on the Abteilung command course, and that I would be taking over 3 Company as company leader. We were still in good spirits when the information came that the Americans were nearby. We left the chateau in a long column of cars, led by the open car of the commanding officer. A bottle of cognac was passed from car to car. Then my vehicle went on strike and I fell behind the column. Because I had no map and did not know the area, Lieutenant Brodhagen's car stayed behind with me. The commanding officer wanted to go to the Tross. Since night was now falling and we could not begin anything in our condition, we pushed the car into cover and slept until daybreak. We awoke to find the roads remarkably empty, only the odd lone vehicle. We were told that the Americans had reached Amiens, which was where we were headed. Therefore our rear services would probably have pulled out long before. Our purpose now was to skirt around the enemy, bypass Amiens and cross the Somme. We were led to believe that all bridges over the Somme had been blown up during the night, and so assumed that our Abteilung would already have crossed. We got the car going again, but the unlikelihood of reaching the Somme before the Americans got there worried us. Approaching a small village, we heard MG fire close at hand. Standing on the bonnet, I could see American tanks moving in from the other end of the village. We turned around and fled at full speed. Using country lanes and tracks across fields, we reached the Somme, and by a stroke of luck found a small bridge still intact. At Péronne we met up again with German troops, but could find no trace of the Abteilung. We pressed on through Arras and Lens to Lille, pursuing unsuccessful inquiries at every commandantur along the way for news of our Abteilung. The many military cemeteries, some German, reminded us of the heavy fighting which had raged in this region during the First World War. Finally, in Lille, we spotted an Abteilung signpost, made contact and reported to the command post in the nearby village of Seclin. The previous evening, the commanding officer had ordered a complete withdrawal, in the process saving the Tross from capture by the Americans at Amiens. At Seclin, I also found 3 Company. It had lost the last of its panzers at Amiens, although the bulk of the company Tigers had been lost to enemy action at Vexin, Mantes, or for lack of the possibility of repair. At Seclin I stayed 2 days in fine private quarters with bath. High Command had provisionally ordered the Abteilung to Liège, but it had no fuel, this being something which each company had to organise for itself. While the other companies went from one fuel compound to another and found nothing, I discovered the whereabouts of a petrol dump, drove there and with much cunning and deception got a chit. I had gained experience in how to deal with such departments, and the word tiger still had its allure, even here. Thus, not only 3 Company, but the whole Abteilung was able to move out. In normal times, of course, my methods would have been impossible, but amidst all this hopeless confusion and the total collapse of the front, it was every man for himself. Over the next 3 nights, the Abteilung travelled about 300 kilometres to the northwest. The companies made a motley impression. Having no panzers but most of the crews, it was a problem to transport these men. Almost every panzer crew found a parked car somewhere and got it going, and so the company had more than 14 additional vehicles. Scherf had a fantastic American Packard, a sports car able to achieve a speed in excess of 100 kilometers per hour, phenomenal for the time. To see it and then be invited to drive such a vehicle was a real joy. Our course took us through Tournai-Loos, Waterloo and Leuven. A company muley, a fully tracked lorry, was set on fire in a low-level fighter attack. 1 man was killed. After parking in a wood near Tienen, I was given a special assignment by the commanding officer. The Abteilung was to proceed to Sennelager camp near Paderborn to rest and reorganize. I had to fetch the written orders from an outpost of the General, Panzer Troops West at Liège. In order that the Abteilung should have their contents as soon as possible after receipt, I was assigned a radio car. The Liège outpost did not have the documents, and so I had to continue to the HQ of the General, Panzer Troops West. This was located in a small wood in the Ardennes, which I reached after a long drive. Here I was informed by the General Staff Officer that I would have to call at the HQ of General Feldmarschall Model at Spa, near Liège, for the document. Model himself was in Namur, and so that was my next port of call. The town was not a very inviting-looking place, with hardly any German troops, but many suspicious figures lurking in the shadows. Of course, Model was not in Namur, but I could find him at a conference with SS Obergruppenführer Sepp Dietrich at Gembloux. I simply had to get these written orders. Model had already left Dietrich's HQ, and there was nothing more I could do except return to Spa. I got there at 11 p.m, and towards 2 a.m. our movement order was in my hands. I passed it on to Abteilung by radio and completed my assignment. I arrived back in Liège in the early morning. One could sense everywhere the 11th hour mood. Apparently the enemy was not far off. In the street I met Major Skultatus, whom I knew from Fallingbostel. In conversation he remarked casually that there was a fuel train in the goods yard at Liège. I saw my chance, excused myself as quickly as possible, and drove to the station. There the train stood with the necessary fuel. A junior lieutenant was responsible for sharing it out. I requested 1 wagon for my Abteilung, and because the word tiger worked its magic again, my request was fulfilled. By radio I informed Abteilung, which had got to Maastricht, and asked for the entire fuel detachment to get here in order to take it over. At that distance they needed 4 hours to arrive. During that time I would have to protect my fuel. From all sides, vehicles now appeared like moths to the flame to bag some. At first I did a patrol around the wagon, believing that my mere presence would keep all undesired visitors away. Not so. Scarcely had I put a few steps between myself and the wagon, than it was opened at the rear, and the first barrel started walking. I spotted it in time, and from now on sat on my barrels, pistol in hand, and only left my perch when Lieutenant Copper arrived with the fuel detachment. The journey back through Liège was anything but pleasant. The first shootouts had begun, always a sign that the Americans would soon be arriving. Towards evening I reported back to the Abteilung. The company was in the small town of Meersen, where I was given a very nice room by a pro-German family. During the 2 days we spent here, this little Dutch place seemed like a small paradise. In Maastricht, a German provisions warehouse was being thrown open in order to prevent the contents falling into enemy hands. With Lieutenants Rambo and Wagner, who had meanwhile been transferred to 3 Company, I happened to be passing just at that moment. I got my driver to fetch an empty lorry from our company, and we packed it full with tinned food of all kinds. Chocolate, wine, liqueurs, cigarettes. We towed out case upon case of foodstuffs for our field kitchen. For whom had all this been originally intended? We Frontschwein would never have got to see it. In the weeks following, we in the company gorged ourselves. Peas with carrots or asparagus were now to be found on the menu more often, a change from dried vegetables and dried potatoes. Later at Paderborn, every man going on leave received a packet to take home. On the 5th of September 1944, we left Meissen. We knew the road from here perfectly, and the individual company vehicles were sent out at 5-minute intervals because of the danger of air attack. I took a German family with me in my car, since they had no other way to get back to the Reich. After a few incidents with enemy aircraft, that afternoon we crossed the German border. It was a strange feeling to be back in Germany under these circumstances, and not wonderful. Our destination was Düren, and 3 Company was lodged in the village of Elsen. It was an odd coincidence that my old 1st Company or Panzer Regiment 35 had also stopped here before the beginning of the French campaign. Thus I soon renewed contacts, for the inhabitants of the village remembered us well. The company was given the best of everything, the villagers competing to outdo each other. Next day our vehicles were loaded at Düren station, and on the afternoon of the 7th of September I travelled with the commanding officer, Hauptmann Schurf, Hauptmann Wiegand, Stabsarzt Dr. Schramm and Benjamin in one of 2 saloon cars for the drive to Sennelager camp at Paderborn.